During the Middle Ages, some legal systems believed that divine judgment could reveal a person's guilt or innocence. One of the most extreme methods used was called an ordeal, a physical test meant to let God decide the outcome. For pregnant women accused of adultery or unlawful pregnancy, these tests were often severe and dangerous. One of the best known was the ordeal of boiling water, mentioned in 9th century laws from the Carolingian Empire and later included in church law. In this ordeal, the woman had to reach into a pot of boiling water to pull out an object, like a ring or stone. Her hand was then wrapped up for 3 days. If it healed without infection, she was considered innocent. If it became infected, she was found guilty. These ordeals were especially harmful to pregnant women. The extreme pain and risk of infection often led to miscarriages or even death. Yet both church and government officials accepted these outcomes as part of divine justice. Another form of ordeal involved carrying a red-hot iron bar for a certain distance. If the woman's burns healed cleanly, she was declared innocent. If not, she could face harsh penalties like public whipping or being locked away permanently. In that era, social honor was more valued than kindness. Even pregnant women were forced to undergo these dangerous rituals. Their fate wasn't in their own hands. It depended on fire, boiling water, and the church's silent judgment, branded in the town square. In some parts of medieval Europe, women accused of adultery, especially those who were pregnant, were publicly branded. Picture a woman tied to a post in the town square while a red-hot iron is pressed into her skin. This was a legal punishment meant to leave a permanent mark, both physical and social. Laws in Christian Europe at the time treated a woman's private life as a matter of public concern. A pregnancy outside of marriage was seen as clear proof of wrongdoing, and the legal system responded with punishments meant to shame and control. In regions like Normandy and Brittany in France, local laws allowed branding on the face, often the forehead or cheek, to label women as morally corrupt. This practice had roots in Roman law, where branding was used to punish enslaved or lower-class women accused of moral offenses. In England during the 13th century, church courts handled many cases of so-called fornication. While branding wasn't as common there, public punishment was still routine. Women would sometimes be made to walk barefoot through the town, dressed in a white sheet and a rope around the neck, openly confessing their sin. These punishments were recorded in church court documents from places like York and London. In German-speaking areas of the Holy Roman Empire, branding remained legal through the 1400s. Religious thinkers like Thomas Aquinas supported these punishments. He believed that sins involving the body were especially shameful, not because they were the worst, but because they weakened a person's reason and self-control. In his view, the damage done to the soul was long-lasting, even if the act itself was brief. In this world, a pregnant woman's body could become a symbol of public values. Branding wasn't just about the act itself. It sent a message that the rules of society were written not just in law books, but on people's skin. Whipping for illegitimate pregnancy. By the 1100s, public whipping had moved beyond monasteries and into broader society. Courts, both religious and secular, used it to punish women who were pregnant outside of marriage. Pregnancy alone was often treated as automatic proof of wrongdoing. No trial was needed. It was considered a visible sign that moral rules had been broken and the Christian social order disrupted. In medieval England, church records from cities like York show that women accused of fornication, especially if they were pregnant, were made to perform public penance. This often meant walking to the streets barefoot in symbolic clothing, admitting their actions aloud. Similar scenes are found in church records from Ely and Exeter, where women had to do this on holy days in front of their community. These rituals were designed to shame and control. While the church focused on spiritual correction, secular courts often included corporal punishment, whipping being one of the more common forms. Religious leaders defended these practices. One influential figure, Peter Damian, argued that physical suffering was a small price to pay for saving the soul. Religious thinkers like Peter Damian strongly believed in flagellation or self-whipping as a way to purify the soul. He argued that punishing the body could save it from eternal punishment. For him, this act mirrored the suffering of Christ himself. But for pregnant women, the situation was even harsher. Not only were they physically punished, but they were also blamed for endangering both themselves and their unborn children. In medieval culture, compassion wasn't part of the response to pregnancy outside marriage. Instead, it brought pain and public shame, all under the label of penance. Locked away in monasteries until the baby was born. Inside medieval convents, not every woman entered by choice. For women, especially nuns, accused of breaking vows or becoming pregnant out of wedlock, confinement in a monastic cell was a common punishment. These were not places for quiet reflection or healing. They were strict, isolating, and often harsh. By the 1100s, it was common in parts of Western Europe for families or local leaders to send unmarried pregnant women into convents. The goal wasn't to support them, but to hide the scandal and enforce strict moral codes. This was sometimes done without a formal trial. After the Gregorian reforms of the late 11th century, the Church increased its control over how clergy and religious communities behaved. If a nun became pregnant, it was considered a serious breach of her vows. In some cases, she could be locked away in her convent for the rest of her life as a form of punishment. The Council of London in 1102 called for severe penance for clergy involved in such acts, though how those rules were applied depended on the region. But this type of punishment wasn't limited to nuns. In areas like Flanders, parts of France, and the Holy Roman Empire, unmarried pregnant women, especially those from higher social classes, could be sent into monastic confinement until they gave birth. This wasn't about health or safety. It was to avoid public shame and quietly send the child away afterward. Conditions in these cells were often bleak. Women sent to Benedictine or Cistercian monasteries for moral offenses lived in silence, were given only basic food, and were expected to pray constantly. In some cases, once the baby was born, the child would be handed over to a church-run orphanage or hidden away. Church leaders often described this treatment as a form of mercy, protection from sin and disgrace. But in practice, it was about controlling women's bodies and covering up anything seen as socially or morally disruptive, forced to leave their villages. For many women, punishment wasn't limited to convents or public shame. In some villages, if a woman became pregnant outside of marriage, she could be ordered to leave immediately and permanently. There was no formal trial, no defense, just a command from local elders or clergy. Leave and never come back. This type of expulsion was common in later medieval Europe, especially in small towns where religious values were closely tied to community reputation. An unmarried pregnant woman was seen as a serious threat to that image. In England, records from manorial courts sometimes show cases where women in this situation were fined, made to perform public penance, or exiled from a village. In areas like Norfolk and Suffolk, these women were often treated as if they had lost all respect and standing in the community. Banishment didn't just punish, it erased. A woman forced out because of her pregnancy became invisible, forgotten by the same people who once knew her. Her presence was seen as incompatible with village life, and her absence was treated as a solution. Through these punishments, ordeals, confinement, public branding, and exile, medieval society put enormous pressure on women, especially those who were pregnant outside of wedlock. The mix of law, religion, and fear shaped a system that caused deep suffering, often in the name of moral order. These historical practices remind us how control over women's bodies has long been linked to questions of power, morality, and justice. As St. Jerome once wrote, "Virginity can be lost by a thought," a warning that reflects just how heavily the rules of that time weighed on women's lives. The stories of how pregnant women were treated in medieval Europe aren't just grim tales from a distant past. They're a mirror reflecting the deep roots of moral judgment, social control, and gender inequality. From ordeals by boiling water to public branding, from forced isolation in convents to outright banishment, these were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a broader system. A system that used religion, law, and fear to keep women in line, especially when their bodies made the consequences of private choices public. For many women, pregnancy wasn't a time of support or care. It became evidence used against them. It stripped away their agency and made them the focus of harsh punishment. What's striking is how little power these women had over their own futures. Their fate was often decided not by what they said or did, but by how they appeared, visibly pregnant and unmarried. marked not just by life growing inside them, but by the weight of social judgment. These historical practices may seem distant now, but the echoes are still around us. The idea that women's choices, especially around reproduction, must be publicly judged or controlled hasn't disappeared. While the methods have changed, the debates around bodily autonomy, shame, and punishment continue. That's why looking back matters. It reminds us how long these battles have been fought and how high the cost has been for those without a voice. Understanding the lived experiences of these women helps us ask better questions today. Who defines morality? Who gets to judge? And what happens when a person's dignity is placed second to public image? This history also reminds us of the resilience of those who endured. Despite isolation, pain, and public disgrace, these women carried life forward, often in silence, often erased, but never entirely lost to time. By remembering their stories, we restore part of their humanity. In telling the truth about the past, we shine a light on the choices we have now to build a more just world, where people are supported rather than shamed, heard rather than silenced, and where no one is punished for simply being human.